How is everybody? I keep waiting for the time that we all get used to this format, and appreciate you all being here, and appreciate you all putting up with my probably inevitable technical difficulties. So yeah, thanks for having me. My name is Erica Johnson. Like Molly said, I'm the Director of American Friends Service Committee's Iowa office. And so for those who don't know, AFSC is a 104-year-old Quaker organization. We've got offices all around the world. And in Iowa, we've been around for about 50 years. And we work on generally broadly issues related to the Quaker core values of peace and justice. And so in Iowa, we've worked on immigrant rights issues since the 90s, since 1995, and we provide legal services. We have what's called one staff person who's called a Department of Justice accredited staff. And she helps with people filing for immigration paperwork, everything from naturalization to family petitions, where families are requesting that their kids or spouses or some other family member also join them in the United States while they're here. DACA, TPS, all kinds of things. And then we also work on advocacy and organizing, and we believe that the US immigration system is really outdated and needs to be fixed. And until it's fixed, it's causing a lot of undue harm on families and burden on individuals that is an injustice. And so we work on bringing individuals together in community to strategize solutions to the issues that they see in their own communities. So what I hope to do is provide all of you, we said the session was going to be interactive. Hopefully we'll be able to do it. So hopefully what we'll try to do is do an interactive session to help give you all tools for supporting your students, your families in the face of anti-immigrant socio-political context. And so, like I said, we'll see if this works. So if we could do this, I would love for people to pop in the chat, if I can pull that up, if I can see the chat. What are some things that you're seeing your families, your students struggle with? What are there specific things that you hope to learn that I can particularly attempt to focus on during our time together? And what are you most fearful of for your students? So go ahead and drop that in the chat if you want to. If anybody feels like unmuting themselves and speaking, we can take like maybe one or two.
Yeah,
Paula, I'm going to say one more time, please do not unmute yourself. You can write your questions into the chat window.
Okay, I thought I
So we've got, I'll just read some out then. Knowing their rights. Like if ICE shows up, people losing hope, access to community resources, students that don't talk about the issues, people so how to start the conversation and sort of indicate that you're supportive in a way that helps them feel protected and acknowledged. Fearful of students' lives being torn apart, people being taken by force from our school, afraid of being able to get back in the US. Okay. Well, thank you. That's helpful. And I think hopefully we can cover all of those things, assuming again that the technology works out. So I wanted to start by kind of just reviewing some of the patterns that we've been seeing in Iowa and talk a little bit to give you all an idea of how Iowans have been responding over the last several years. So I guess I'm not really sure. Is everybody from Iowa or is this a larger group?
Larger group.
I suspected. Okay. So So some of the things that are happening in Iowa, I would imagine are happening all across the country, and folks hear news reports of ICE conducting sweeps or raids, and refugee admissions being at almost zero at this point. And so immigration and issues related to refugees and refugee families have been in the news for a while now. And so I think a lot of times people might think that this isn't happening in Iowa because Iowa is known as a strong agricultural state and mostly white, not a lot of diversity, but that's just like everywhere else. That's not true. Iowa has a pretty diverse population, and some of our, especially in certain communities across the state where jobs have called people for the past 40 years to leave their homes and come in search of jobs and fill much needed workforce demands across our state. And so much like other places in Iowa, we're seeing an increase in ICE activity. We've seen some of the largest worksite raids in the country over the last 15 years or so. We saw a really big raid in Marshalltown in 2006. We saw a really big raid in Postville in 2008. And then more recently, we saw a larger scale raid in Mount Pleasant, which is actually my hometown. That's where I grew up. And so it's particularly heartbreaking to see the way that families have been torn apart. But we also see ICE doing things like you see in this picture here. So this is a picture, hopefully folks can see it, that was taken on an interstate that runs through Des Moines 235. And you can see there's 3 unmarked vehicles. Those are all ICE vehicles. They have Iowa license plate. They're not marked in any way. If you zoom in, you can see that there's some like retrofitted like lights, like police car lights in the front windshield. They're pulling over the car. The person that took the pictures had gotten out of the car of the vehicle that was being pulled over. And if you zoom in even more to the agent's vest, you might be able to see that he's wearing a red shirt and a black bulletproof vest that says police. But if you zoom in even closer, you'll see that actually the word ICE is written underneath police, but it's been blacked out by a black marker. And so we see ICE pulling people over on the interstates on their way to work, stopping people a couple blocks out from their home, often in the morning on the way to work. And we see a lot of misrepresentation where ICE agents misrepresent themselves as local police, which creates a lot of fear and confusion in our communities. I don't know if folks, I saw before we started that people were sharing some different like film series or things like that people could watch. One that I'd recommend that's out on Netflix right now is Immigration Nation. If folks haven't seen it, it's a really good, actually it's really hard to watch, but it's a really good snapshot of the way that ICE operates and the way that that they have intentionally sort of dehumanized people over the last several years, and really all that. So in Iowa, we've also seen some really anti-immigrant state legislation. Our state passed what was called the Anti-Sanctuary City Bill in 2018. Several other states have legislation that's similar. And we've also in Iowa seen some of the most virulent anti-immigrant politicians who use the issue of immigration and have for years to try to stoke fear, hate, and divisiveness in our communities. And rather than helping communities deal with the very natural tendencies that happen when different cultures come together, when different backgrounds come together, rather than sort of helping people navigate those things and come to like a consensus as a community, like we've seen in cities like Perry and Marshalltown, they'll, like I said, they sort of stoke that fear and division for the purposes of their reelection campaigns. And so that's what's happening in Iowa. And I would imagine some of you are nodding your heads, things that might sound familiar from where you are too. So the way that Iowans have been responding over the last 3 years is working to build a safety net. And again, these are things that are not unique to Iowa. These are really common things around the country, but we've built what we call an ICE reporting hotline so that people who are targets of ICE activity can call and talk to a dispatcher that can walk them through, what their rights are in that situation. We can dispatch a rapid response team to go conduct what we call ICE investigation to make sure that ICE enforcement activity is done, to make sure that an individual's rights are respected during that interaction. We've also built what we call community response teams across the state. So we've got, I think we're up to 14 of these teams across the state, and these are teams that we built, we designed after experiencing, like I mentioned earlier, the several larger scale worksite raids as a way for community members to come together and prepare for the disaster that is an ICE raid. And we actually use materials from like the Red Cross disaster response toolkits to help communities think through who all the stakeholders are, people who should be involved in that type of disaster response in order to most effectively and efficiently communicate with the immigrant community that is the target of such a activity. And actually, as a side note, we've mobilized these community response teams to respond during the crisis of COVID, the global pandemic, because the disasters are sort of the same as we're seeing play out. That, an ICE raid, the same mechanisms we use to respond to an ICE raid are used when we're responding to whether it's a tornado or a global pandemic. They're the same sort of structures that we can mobilize. We've also built a network of 16 churches that are part of what we call the Iowa Sanctuary Movement. Churches that a handful of which provide literal live-in sanctuary to people who fear or face deportation, and then others who are doing what we call sanctuary in the streets. So accompanying people to their ICE check-ins or going to court appointments or, sponsoring asylum seekers as they navigate the asylum process. And we've also been doing a lot of Know Your Rights presentations. So that's what we're seeing in Iowa. And how Iowans are responding. So this is the part that hopefully, we can talk about the things that you can be doing specifically to start to think through how you can be specific in your families and your student. So, and if there are questions as I go, I don't know if somebody can keep an eye on that. We can pause and do that. So to start, if you see, I put a link there under Educate Yourself on the lower left-hand side of the sort of bluish gray color block. So that's a little document, a Google document that I've put together that has a whole slew of resources that I'll be talking about. So if you can, hopefully that works for everybody and you can click through and get that through the presentation. Yeah, okay. So I'm just gonna go kind of bullet point by bullet point and talk through what each of these things means or what I mean by each of them. So the first one is understand your rights and obligations within your profession. And so not knowing where you all come from in the different contexts that you come from, there are certain things, regarding students, families, information that you are obligated to protect. And so you all know those things better than I do, I would imagine, but making sure that you're up to date on what those expectations are, what those rules are, is the first place to start. From there, doing a little bit of additional research and finding out what sort of protocol, if any, your institution or your organization has in place in case of ICE activity. There's a good resource that I'll click on here. This is from the Immigrant Legal Resource Center, which is also a really helpful organization that we use a lot. They've got a guidance for schools, but they just broke down, I scroll down here, a case study for San Francisco. So what I'm talking about specifically here is checking to see if your school has any policy related to what happens, what people should do if ICE shows up. So in this case, and we've got several school districts across Iowa, including Des Moines School District, that has a policy not to allow ICE into the school setting. Rather, they're directed to the superintendent, and then the superintendent is prepared to look through whatever documentation that ICE might have, and then work with them from there in order to make sure that students and school faculty, staff, personnel are safe. If your school doesn't have one of those policies in place, it might be good to think through how to get one of those. Another big thing that we're encouraging, well, we've been talking a lot about this lately, actually, is finding out what, if any, systems your institution or organization has in place regarding mental health of immigrant families. So this is something, again, that COVID has laid bare a lot of the inequities in our system that, that a lot of us knew were there already. Some folks didn't, but they've become even more abundantly clear at this stage. And the mental health of immigrant and refugee families is in crisis in this moment. And so figuring out what systems, if any, are in place to support those families regarding mental health is really important. Next, understand constitutional rights when interacting with law enforcement. This one's pretty basic, but always good for refreshing. So if you see, I've listed in the resource sheet here, the ACLU, of course, has a lot of really good resources related to it. The ACLU of Iowa has an entire website with all kinds of different know your rights information regarding, everything from voting rights to LGBTQ rights to rights when you're protesting. And they also have another reference here, know your rights when stopped by police, ICE, or FBI. So I'm, on the 6th bullet point here? So understand relevant immigration policies like Senate File 481 and sensitive locations. So I mentioned earlier that Iowa passed in 2018 this anti-sanctuary city law. Basically what that law does is requires local law enforcement to openly collaborate with ICE. And so if your state or your community has any policies like that, it would be really important to understand that for your local context. And then I mentioned specifically the sensitive location memo. And so what that policy is it's a policy that was put in place by the Department of Homeland Security under the Obama administration, and the Trump administration has indicated that they will also abide by that sensitive locations memo, although in recent news over the last week or so, they haven't exactly done that. So what this policy memo says is that there's certain sensitive locations where immigration law enforcement should not be carried out. And so those 5 places: churches, schools, hospitals, public demonstrations. I can't remember that third one. You used to be able to rattle these off really quickly. Let's see. So here's the memo. You can click there. There's a really good explanation of what that is. I'm not going to go through all of that right now. But again, what that policy says is that enforcement shouldn't be carried out in those sensitive locations. So the next bullet point is to learn the resources. Some folks mentioned that they want to be able to help by connecting your students, your families to the community resources. So you've got to learn what those are, not just the things that exist in your local community, but a lot of these things that I'm referencing here as I go. And then the last thing really important is community group. I've already done so. Doing some research to figure out who the local immigrants rights organization is in your community, who the leaders are in the community, and connecting with folks, and just sort of building a relationship with those groups or those individuals is really important. So those are all the, yep.
Are there, and you might want to put your chat, or rather your email in the chat. Are there questions that anyone has for Erica? You can post them in the chat and then she can read them and respond to them.
Yeah, I just dropped my email in the chat, so folks have that. So those are kind of the things that you can be doing to prepare yourself. And then from there, the next step is giving resources to families. So again, if you're looking at the Google Doc that I put together with the resources, all of this is listed there. So this is sort of the second group of bullet points. So what we like to do when we give Know Your Rights presentations is we use some really helpful, where are they? These packets here. So these packets, the Know Your Rights packets, are what we use when we talk about like constitutional rights with everyone, with folks that we're presenting to, community members that we're presenting to. So the Constitution of the United States applies to everyone in the country, whether you're documented or not. And so we like to walk through families, like with students, with our clients, what those constitutional rights are in really basic ways. And then we think through the next steps out of that. And so even though we're sort of acknowledging that even though we all have rights, that even if you're exercising your rights and everything goes really well in an interaction, those rights might not be respected, or it could be that that there is nothing, you know, that you can do, and that you are arrested, that, you know, ICE has a valid warrant, or you end up in detention at some point. And so thinking this through ahead of time, not just understanding what your constitutional rights are and practicing exercising those, but thinking through your family and building a plan together so that you can, like we like to say, plan for the worst and hope for the best. And so we've got copies of family planning guides there that you can walk through with folks. We've got these, like I said, these larger, bigger Know Your Rights packets that go into much greater detail of what people's rights are, things to look out for, and how to plan. And then we've got the small red cards that you can see a little picture of those on the screen there at the lower right hand corner. Those are just little cards that, you know, if an individual has an encounter with law enforcement, they can present that to the law enforcement officer, and it says on one side in English and the other side there's lots of different languages available. You know, I'm exercising my right to remain silent. I want to speak to a lawyer, basically. In Iowa, we have another really helpful resource, lists of immigration lawyers. In Iowa, we have a huge need for ethical and low or no cost immigration attorneys. Other states have bigger pools than we have. And so we've got a list. I put a link to our list there. Obviously, it's not helpful if you're not from Iowa, but that's something that you can look for in your state and your local area too. And then in Iowa, we've got, like I mentioned, that our ICE reporting hotline. It's possible, it's likely, it's probable that your state has something similar. And so making sure that you hand that out to your families as a resource is really helpful too. Okay, so then ICE, sorry, good question. ICE stands for Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Okay, lots of questions. I think this is my last like concrete slide here, and then we'll go through and go back to some of the questions. Is that all right? Okay. So in terms of then, you know, how you can have this conversation in safe ways so that your students and families know that you're there to be supportive. I mean, you know, be creative. So you can there's lots of ways that you can show that you're welcoming, and the ways that you do that need to be really public. And so whether that's putting, you know, signs up in your classroom, you can see the picture here is a campaign that was put on by United We Dream. I'm an educator, and I am, you know, supportive of my undocumented families. I'm supportive of my immigrant students. Another way you can be publicly supportive is creating a sanctuary policy for your institution or organization. I'll say that the term sanctuary has become a politically loaded term. I recognize that, and I reject the premise. I reject that that's a word that should be politicized. My dad was a pastor. I grew up being raised, sitting in the sanctuary the majority of my life, and I recognize sanctuary as a word that is intended to mean safety. And so I think that it's possible to recognize the politics of this issue, but also push back against that in ways that express our values as a community. And so you know, when I say sanctuary policy, that could be something at your local school or institution, or in your church, or in your community. There's lots of different versions of like a sanctuary policy. Create mental health support systems for immigrant families. Display signs, conduct a marketing campaign, like I mentioned, the image there on the screen. The first sort of 3 bullet points, or the 4 kind of all blend together, right? The point is to be public with whatever you're doing, and to make sure that people know that this is something that you feel strongly about, and you're telling the community that you're doing this, as a way to indicate to folks who might not feel comfortable sharing their status or asking questions that you are a safe person to approach about this issue. Build a local community response team, or connect with your local team if you've already have one. Host an Immigration 101 training for staff and allies in the community. This is another thing that we've been doing a lot. Probably some of the questions in the chat are, I would guess, are related to not really fully understanding the U.S. immigration system. And so, you know, basic things like, we hear often, like, you know, why don't people just do it the right way? And I think that what that statement is an acknowledgement that that people don't understand the U.S. immigration system, and how it actually is that what the pathways are that are available to people to migrate into this country, and that of those options, very few people are actually able to access those. And so that leaves a whole, you know, millions of other people who can't access any pathways that currently exist. And so when I began this presentation, I noted that in our office, we do have a legal services component of what we do, but even as we're operating in that system, we're recognizing that the system is outdated. It needs to be updated. It needs to be made to be in line with the current needs of our country and the current needs of family who want to migrate here, the companies who want to hire on them, all of that. And so hosting an Immigration 101 training is a really good way to break down the reality of the U.S. immigration system and help people ask questions and understand what it is that perhaps they didn't know about it, and the ways that it has changed over the years, or not changed, as the case may be. And then the last thing is host an informational meeting for families or other educators, service providers. And so that would be something more like a very specific Know Your Rights presentation, where you dig into the constitutional information about what it is your rights are in the scenario, and help people understand and practice exercising those rights should the need arise. Okay. So I've seen that there are questions. How do we want to do this? Just kind of go back through and answer as many as possible?
I think that would be a good idea. There's so many.
Do you have favorites?
I think a lot of people, there were some questions about the red cards. Could you elaborate a little bit more on those?
Yeah, so so the red cards, I can just pull up here. The ones that I'm pulling up are English and Spanish. And so the Immigrant Legal Resource Center, ILRC, has a whole slew of these. And so what we often do is we just print off this page and then cut it. You can see it's like shows you where to cut, and then hand those out individually to individuals. And so, like I mentioned earlier, what the purpose of these, the intention of these, is that an individual can use this, keep this card in their wallet. Obviously this isn't red here, but the idea is that you can print it off. You can order a bunch of red cards if you want to from the website, Immigrant Legal Resource Center. But on one side, it talks in Spanish about if it explains that you have constitutional rights. Don't open the door if an immigration agent is knocking. Don't answer any questions. You have the right to remain silent. Don't sign anything that you don't understand without first talking to a lawyer. And then just explaining, you know, give this card to an agent. And so then on the other side in English, you can see that the card says, I do not wish to speak with you, the person exercising their right to remain silent. I'm not going to sign anything or hand you any documents. I do not give you permission to enter my house, those kind of things. I do not consent to a search, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, so if you go to the website, I see that it's not on here, but the organization that I keep referencing, Immigrant Legal Resource Center, ILRC, has like a whole slew of these cards that you can download and print in lots of different languages, not just English and Spanish.
Thank you. There's a bunch of good questions in the chat window here. There's one from Alyssa that says, what could be done on the university and college level to educate future teachers so that they're prepared when they enter school system and be ready to protect and also educate their students? It is as simple as holding seminars or group discussions about it, or should it be more personal search on the learner's part?
It's a good question. I mean, I think it depends. I think it depends where individuals are. I think that, again, a lot of people, I've been doing this work for about 15 years now, and I think it honestly wasn't in Iowa. It wasn't until these large-scale worksite raids started happening in Iowa that people really understood that something was wrong with our U.S. immigration system. So I moved back to Iowa in about 2006, and I remember hearing at the time a lot of, why don't they just do it the right way, or we just need to enforce our U.S. immigration laws, that kind of thing. You know, we need to know who's here, protect our communities. And then the raid happened, and what people saw was what happens when U.S. immigration laws are enforced. And what happens is that hardworking parents are put in our case, in the postal raid, people were held in what we call the cattle congress, which was the county fairgrounds, in a makeshift detention center on the county fairgrounds. And they were held there, and they were processed through really quickly without any information about what their rights were. And meanwhile, you know, children were left at school, and kids didn't go to school for the next several days. People were really traumatized. People were hiding in a church in Postville when that raid happened, for days after the raid occurred. And so in Iowa, when people saw those things happen, I started hearing like, wow, like it seems like there's something that I didn't understand here. It seems like there's something like that the enforcement of U.S. immigration laws doesn't line up with my values as a human being. And so we were able then to sort of take a step back and talk about what the actual U.S. immigration system is. And so if you've got, you know, students who are aware that something's not right, and they realize that they don't really have the information, then it would be good to start with an immigration one-on-one session. If you've got a group of students who are, you know, sort of have moved beyond that, and they understand that the U.S., what the system is, and they've seen it negatively impact their students, then perhaps it would be good to have a Know Your Rights presentation and help them understand what people's constitutional rights are, and help them have that information in their own heads so that they can put that into their students' heads when they go out into the classroom setting. Does that answer the question?
Thank you very much. I think so. I do want to just tell everyone that we need to end promptly at 1:45 so that the exhibitor sessions can start, but we do have time for some more questions. There's a good question here that says, is there a way to get training come to one school for teachers to know how to act in case ICE shows up?
Yeah, again, I would think that would be up to individual schools, but what we have done is provide, you know, presentations to teachers about again, it goes back to the Constitution. What are people's basic constitutional rights when interacting with law enforcement? And you have the right to remain silent. And then that information then, when coupled with the sensitive locations memo, the policy that discourages ICE from engaging in enforcing immigration law in these sensitive locations, places like churches and schools. Those are sensitive places because they're areas that are, where people's personal information is uniquely protected, as it is in schools and hospitals, or it's places where people's constitutional rights are uniquely protected in their engaging in expressing their religious identity, or their constitutional rights to freedom of speech and engaging in a protest or things like that. So those two things coupled together, the know your rights information, what are people's constitutional rights, and then thinking through a sensitive locations, the policy memo and how that would play out at your school, what would actually happen, I think would be those two things would be a good place to start to have that discussion.
I think we have time for at least one more question, and then at the very end of the talk, if you wouldn't mind sharing your email one more time. So we have a question that says, how do you begin the conversation of a sanctuary policy? Could you share a copy of one?
Ooh, yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, there's all kinds of different versions out there, I think. From what I remember, from what the Des Moines School Board talked about in, I think it was probably 2017, so about 3 years ago now. And these are policies that, college campuses have, churches have, hospitals have, elementary, middle school buildings have. And basically, again, if I remember correctly, the Des Moines School Board's policy says something like, if ICE wants to talk to a student, they have to contact the superintendent, and then the superintendent will review any information that the ICE agents have and make a determination of the action steps that will happen. Those are, in broad terms, what I can remember of what that policy looked like.
Maybe we have time for even another. Let's see here. Let's see. So we have a couple people responding to questions. So I'm just kind of scrolling through, which is good. Everyone's helping each other with answers to things. Let's see here. Let's see. I'm very happy to see all the discussion in the comments, because this is what grassroots organizing is about, is getting to know each other and sharing resources. A lot of questions about what the legal process is for undocumented immigrants to become legal. A lot of questions about what are immigrant rights. Yeah, would you be able to speak on any of that just a little bit more before we have to call time?
Yeah, it's 4 minutes. I think that's why it's really important that folks would, engage in what we call the Immigration 101 presentations. And I haven't actually seen any that are online. I could certainly look for some of those and paste those on that Google resource sheet if that's helpful. But there's, the U.S. immigration is set up to allow people to migrate because of work, blood, sweat, and tears, basically. So blood, meaning you've got family here; sweat, meaning your work or your job, you've got a job here; and tears because of some sort of trauma in your home country. Those are sort of the asylum laws and refugee laws, right? And so for a lot of undocumented folks, the problem is that they don't qualify for those things. And so because there's so few visas allowed for people to work visas that are allowed, and because the process to who can immigrate, what family connections you need to immigrate, because those are also so few, and the visas that are allowed for those are so few, and they take such a long time to process. The immigration system is just completely, like I've been saying, outdated. It hasn't been updated in decades, right? And so for for undocumented folks who came here, for example, in the 90s to work in the packing plant industry. That was a time that the economy in the US was booming, and those jobs needed to be filled by folks, and immigrants were willing to do that very hard work. And so the problem was that we didn't update the immigration system to keep in line with those labor demands. And we didn't update that immigration system then to accommodate for the reality of people's family ties. And so what we have now is a huge mess. We can all agree that we have a huge mess. And so, I believe that a country who put a man on the moon can certainly figure out how to fix our immigration system. And we can do it humanely, and we can honor people's dignity in that. And we can do it with an eye towards the future, and with trying to figure out, certainly not repeating the mistakes that we've made in the past. And so that's where I hope that we're going. In the meantime, what we need to do is let people know that immigrant rights are human rights, and that we all have, we're all protected by the US Constitution. We are all protected by certain values that we all hold dear, and that in this moment where we see that those rights are being abused from other people, whether it's ICE detention performing hysterectomies on women while they're held in detention without their consent, or families being torn apart by ICE raids in Iowa. We as a community, whatever our role is, need to be doing everything that we can be doing to make sure that our families and our students are protected in this moment. And so these are hopefully some little tools that you all can all take away to do that wherever you are.
Thank you very much. I speak for everyone. Thank you so much. This has been so informative. I'm going to end the session now so that you guys can attend your next sessions. And Erica, thank you so much.
Thank you. Best of luck.